popular. This was the British Webley service revolver. These were standard issue for like World War I and stuff like that by officers. Here you go. And naturally, obviously, these saw service in the Irish War of Independence and so on and so forth. Very easy to get. The IRA really liked short weapons like this, simply because a lot of the fighting, a lot of the ambush-style assassination attempts were done with weapons like this because, I mean, why do you think we wear these big coats? You can see it a bit better, so this is basically, top right, auto ejector and the whole 9 yards. Very nice revolver, I'd say. And on top of that, I'm going to get this out once I find it in my pocket. I got something else. It's this. It's a 1914 Mauser pocket pistol, also World War I, obviously, and also pretty common as well. Another small gun to use for ambush-style tactics and stuff like that. It's obviously used by officers.
No sé.
And yeah. Any other questions? Any questions by anybody here? About any of the weapons, uniforms, why we do this, sir?
What's the origin of the hats that you're wearing?
Okay.
Because it looks a bit
Interesting
like
story.
Australian or New Zealand.
I've been told that more times than I should.
It's like time number 8.
Yeah, we're at that. So, but yeah, to be fair, the reason why it came from before there was the IRA, there was the Irish Volunteers, which was a paramilitary organization itself. Started around 1913, and it was the idea of basically, doing drill, doing military-style tactics, and kind of driving home the movement. This was part of the uniform, and it extended onward into the Easter Uprising, the Irish War of Independence, and further on. And it was originally called like Francia hats or slouch hats, and they kind of based it off not the Australians or New Zealanders, but actually off the Dutch Boers during the Boer War. If you guys know about that. South Africa and all that. So, and that kind of came from that, really, to be honest.
Is that seat reserved?
No, it's not. You can sit there.
How much?
20 bucks. Any questions? Any more questions? There's no dumb questions. If you have questions, go ahead and ask.
Is all your stuff off by that broom handle gun?
This is a 1908 Chinese warlord contract.
Yeah.
So that's a real.
Yep.
Going to auction.
I got it at a gun store, and about 6 people have tried to buy it off of me, and I told them no.
What did the British try to do to suppress
Yeah, you want to talk about
Brute force. They thought, just simply by scaring us, they thought they could possibly end it with the formation of the Black and Tans, and there was another one known as the Oxys. If you look that up, they did a lot of terrible, terrible things. Truly, terrible stuff. They were no better than terrorists, to be brutally honest with you. They were known as the Black and Tans. I should tell you this. It's because they had a mix of uniforms of both RIC uniforms, which are more of a black color, and British khaki, which is like this color. Just, to cover that so they could supply them with uniforms and all that good stuff. And it just made things worse in the end, how they did everything, really. They brought down the city of Cork in Ireland and cost millions of dollars in damages. A number of people were killed unnecessarily. One person. They burned down the city all because of that. Just to try and scare us and flush us out. And it just made things worse. It just drove people to side with the Irish. So it was all because they were literally, it was just ex-World War I servicemen and said, hey, we'll pay you a bunch of money a day, go do stuff in Ireland. Basically is that's literally what it was. Not even kidding. They were given no training in policing. They knew military stuff, but they knew nothing on policing, so it was already a risky business. Anything else? This would be for us, this is 1919. Independence, yeah.
Are you Republican?
Yes.
Irish Republican?
Yep.
Irish Republican Army, there's their flag, actually.
No. These are.
Don't you World War II?
When did
French?
Ireland split off from Great Britain?
Technically, yeah. 1922.
Because it became, the thing was, the British were not going to give them an independent 32-county island. That was off the table. However, they were going to offer them what's called the Irish Free State, which was basically a dominion of the British Empire.
Kind of like what happened with Canada and other countries like that under
Australia,
that.
New Zealand.
It was going to work its way into independence slowly but surely without bloodshed. But the anti-treatyists didn't want it. They wanted straight up Ireland or nothing. And it was not going to happen. There was just no way. So the subordinacy between everybody within the IRA with pro-treaty forces and anti-treaty forces. So, and it was definitely a scary thing. That, so.
What have we learned from this time period and what happened so that hopefully we can have peace less likely than not valuable thing? Is it
When it comes to this, war is a terrible thing, and in this case, when you're fighting for the independence of your country, that's one thing, but when you're fighting each other, it's within each other, it's truly awful. And in the end of the day, hopefully we just try and negotiate things peacefully, but between them, there was just no way.
It took them from the point the IRA stopped fighting the pro-treaty and later the British Army during the period which was known as Troubles, and because the Northern Ireland separated from the rest of Ireland, because Northern Ireland
Staunchly unionist Protestant population,
and
they wanted to stay.
and Southern Ireland Catholics, and the Northern Irish were worried that if all of Ireland became its own thing, the Catholic Church would prosecute them. So they decided, no, we're going to stay with England. But at the same time, all of the purists, the Irish purists, they said, we're taking the North. That eventually evolved into Troubles, car bombs, AR-18s, the provisional IRA, they were called. I call them the fake IRA.
They're not, we don't associate with that.
There was one IRA that I care about.
It's the only time.
Let's get our French soldier in
Yep.
for World War I.
Bonjour.
It's over to you. Talk to them.
Oh,
Beautiful.
want to do it? All right.
Parlez-vous français? Non. Tu ne
No.
parles pas français? Okay, I'll speak English then mostly.
Thank you.
I'm with the Quince Une, the 151 RI Infantry Regiment. And we fought at Verdun and numerous other battles, taking thousands of casualties. And this weapon here is a Berthier 1915. Are we firing right now? Should I fire something? Go ahead and fire. So I'll try firing one of these weapons. This is an 8mm. 5-round clip. I don't know what I'm doing.
Step forward a little bit.
Forward. You're good. Yeah.
So that's the weapon that we used.
Why did the clip only have 5 instead of like 6 or a different number?
Well, that was the standard that fit in here. There's a long, detailed history I could go into. This also fire a 3-round clip from that type of weapon called a Labelle, which is also 8mm with a 3-round clip. But they like this weapon because you can actually reload it pretty quickly from the top, and then you can it'll pop out, the empty clip pops out the bottom, which is pretty nice. And this, earlier weapons didn't even have this, so dirt would get in here, so they made sure to put that little thing there, keep the dirt out in the trenches that we have, that we fought in. And I'm wearing the clothes, gray coat, the leg wraps that we would use in the fighting in the trenches. For World War I, the French, we suffered 1.2 million casualties in World War I. It's a huge percentage of the 40 million population of France. And so it was very hard on the French in World War I. By World War II, I think the French were not really up to it anymore after the suffering of World War I. So they kind of caved in sooner than a lot of people think that they should have.
Thank you.
If you have any questions, go ahead, right ahead. While I think of more details that I could present you. There's a wonderful society, the Great War Society. It's a trench system in Pennsylvania where I have fought, and you could go and visit and fight if you join. The Germans, the Bush, we go out there, we want to murder the Bush, kill the Germans. And I have men have come over from France to fight with us to murder the Bush in this trench in Pennsylvania just for fun. And I had an incredible time following a Frenchman through the German.
Comment ça va?
Comment ça va?
Comment ça va?
Très bien, très bien.
Did you say that used a clip rather than a stripper clip?
It uses a little clip, you can fit 5 bullets. It's hard, I'm not sure what you're asking, but the 5 bullets are going at an angle that you put in from the top.
But the clip goes in with the rounds.
Yeah, the clip and round go in, yeah. And then when the clip is empty, it'll pop out the bottom. I'm by no means an expert at this, having just recently did some research on the details.
So that's a totally different feed system than the Mauser had.
Oh, yeah, I'm not familiar with the Mauser system.
So is that based on the Mauser, or?
It was based, as I believe, on the Labelle, which is an earlier and more primitive and inferior weapon that was still used in World War I. But this weapon was much preferred.
What do the leg wraps do for you?
Say that again?
The leg wraps?
Oh yeah,
What does that do
we want
for
to
you?
keep the lice and the mud and dirt out of our legs as much as we can in these muddy trenches that we often had to fight in and make these outrageous frontal assaults. Here, let me do it. Shall I do a charge?
I knew it. I knew you
Well,
were
I won't do it if you want me to.
do it toward me. That way we won't get sued.
Well, I'll do it.
Do it out that way.
Don't get that
I'll
bayonet
give you
next to
the
me.
Do it that way.
proper theory of the bayonet charge. On guard. Advance.
He's yelling in French, of course.
Now, if you can scare the enemy so they run, you won't have to fight them. So that's the proper spirit. Of course, with the machine guns chattering, I don't think you're going to get. You didn't get close enough
Machine
very
gun
often.
would take care of that.
But it's quite a fascinating study of the French experience in World War I. By the end of the war, they were a very much more proficient army, and they actually were important in defeating the Germans. It wasn't just the Americans. The French army had greatly improved their tactics and strategy.
Well, they stopped charging machine guns, for one thing.
Well, yeah, early in the war, they looked like in the first days of the war, they had the bloodiest day. They had, I think, 65,000 dead and wounded in the 22nd of August of 1914 because they had this plan that the French élan, the French spirit, charge was going to get the enemy to run. So they did that against machine guns, and they got cut to pieces. And that particular day was worse than the Somme, worse than any other day probably in history, at least modern history, for battle tactics. But you can read about that was when the Germans, I don't know if you know the history, in 1914 the Germans swung around from the north, come around, the French tried to attack at the joint, break the German armies apart. And that's where they threw their men in with bayonet charges like I just did. by the hundreds of thousands, and it didn't work. So by 1918, the French had a very good little tank. I think it's what's the French company?
Renault.
Yeah, that's who they get. And they had thousands of these little tiny tanks, which were a big help. 2-man tanks that they would use. Plus, the tactics were totally changed and evolved. So the French had probably the best army in the world by 1918.
Sir, could I see your helmet?
Yes. I think it's called an Albion helmet. Now, they started the war wearing kepis. That like a bad idea.
It's all one piece?
Yeah,
Yeah, one kepi.
yeah.
All metal?
It's yeah, stamped. It's stamped.
Yeah,
But
they,
is there any lining?
well, they're supposed to.
Oh,
They're supposed to have a lining.
oh,
Actually,
that's how you lost your hair.
yes. That's how you lose your hair if you don't have a liner.
The French
You
were
were
the
a
first
lion.
to issue helmets. Everybody knows the German still have.
How many men did you say they lost that first day?
They were the first.
Say that again?
That first bayonet charge? How many
Oh,
men?
that bayonet charge on the 22nd of August. Well, it was not just bayonet charge, but there's 65,000 casualties and 27,000 dead a day. Little villages in Belgium. It's well worth researching that. You just look up the bloodiest day of World War I. And you'll see the whole sad history of the early.
And there are cases where somebody took a bullet into the helmet and it didn't go through the liner, it just kind of circled around without the back of the helmet. There are cases where that happened.
He's fought with me in the trenches, so he's no more expert than I would say. A lot more. He's done a lot more in the trenches. There's many stories in night battles.
Très bien. Good
bien.
job. Très bien.
Maybe.
All right. Oh yeah. Look, you'll be here till 3. Can you stay up
I
till 3
believe
in
a
the morning?
French-made weapon, the Berthier, and it would be made, I don't know what town in France.
I can.
It's a good question, but I can't answer. But these weren't too bad. These were, actually, I think they were using these in World War II. Many armies used these.
I actually told him not to introduce himself as a French. Introduce himself as an American fighting voluntary French infantry. He was too tall.
But I've seen pictures of the 151. And
When I'm in that gear, I look just right. I'm perfect. I'm a little short, pudgy guy. Perfect for French.
Some of us were taller. Makes sense. If we would be fine.
You say something.
Well, it's all a fascinating history, well worth studying and reenacting too.
What's it like for the French in the trenches, you know, compared like to the British or when they came over to the barracks?
Well, it was hell, especially in the beginning, as I was saying, the French didn't even stick to their trenches. They kept trying to do open warfare. It didn't work. They got shot down. They were pretty quickly converted. But they had very difficult times in the trenches between the lice and the daily. They hundreds a day would die in the trenches. Artillery, down on top of you. I've been in the trenches and I've seen where they're firing mortars, not mortars, but the ones you put on the end of your rifle.
Grenades.
Rifle grenades onto us. Now these fortunately were not exploding night rifle grenades, but they'd come down on you. And you get a little of the feel of what it was like to be under artillery bombardment. One really fascinating weapon worth studying is the French 75, which was a wonderful, marvelous weapon which successfully stopped the Germans, especially early in the war. It was a quick firing, I think 3-inch round. They fired over sights. And you can, I think you can hear it, read accounts. The German advances were cut to pieces by these French 75 cannons that they had early in the war. They were just a super